Hi everyone, and welcome to this channel called Zuzanareacts, where I learn all about India with your help and I share my European Slovak point of view. So in today's video, I'm going to be looking at the video of Russian and Indian relationships. I know that I've asked about it before as to what the relationship was. Someone mentioned about 1971. So I found a video and I'm so keen to learn more about it. So without further ado, let's dive right in.
1971, when India and Pakistan went to war over the humanitarian crisis in East Pakistan, the forces arrayed against India were formidable. Aircraft from Jordan, Iran, Turkey, and France were bolstering the Pakistani military. The US and the UK were providing moral and naval support. They both dispatched warships to the Indian Ocean. It was a coordinated plan to intimidate India. British ships would target India's western coast. Americans would...
It's interesting that the British ships, considering India was a, English colony,
make a dash in the Bay of Bengal. To counter this multi-dimensional threat, New Delhi sent out an SOS call. It urged global powers for support. And there was only one country that listened, the Soviet Union. It dispatched a fleet of naval vessels from Vladivostok, a number of nuclear-armed ships and atomic submarines. They encircled American and British warships, stopped them from entering India's territorial waters, and prevented a direct clash between India and the US-UK combined. Moscow was a reliable partner for New Delhi when no one else was.
I see.
As Washington consistently ignored India's concerns and sided with Pakistan. Today, the story from 1971 may be a little more than a fond memory, but its geopolitical underpinnings still remain intact. Yes, there have been some minor hiccups and interruptions, but...
Interesting. I still need to get the understanding, and if you could just maybe point me into the direction of the relationship between India and Pakistan, seems may not be much amicable. Not too sure why.
Moscow remains one of India's most dependable partners. And this week, this partnership will enter its next phase. Hello and welcome to Gravitas Plus. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. On the 6th of December, India will receive a rather special guest, the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
Okay.
The visit is important. Its symbolism cannot be downplayed. This is the second time President Putin is stepping out of Russia this year. The first was in June to meet US President Biden in Geneva, and since then he has skipped visits to the G20, the climate summit in Glasgow, and rescheduled his tour of China. He will now come to India first. This indicates Russia's abiding interest in its relationship with India.
Interesting. Well, I mean, to be quite fair, he's been alienated in the West, so this is perhaps why he hasn't really been much out and about. And I know that this is perhaps a year old, but we're there in a year of Russian and Ukrainian war, and perhaps he is persona non grata in the West. And I live in Slovakia and we border with Ukraine, so I see all the people coming here suffering and all that. Actually, my family is close to the borders, not that close, but close enough to see what's going on.
A relationship that has withstood the test of time and geopolitical churns. It helps to begin with history. It's hard to put a date, but India and Russia have known each other for centuries. All the way back to the 4th century, Russia used to be a transit trade route between Europe and India. Indian merchants would frequently visit Moscow, Astrakhan, and St. Petersburg. Russian travelers would visit Indian cities, document the culture and people in their tales. In the 18th century, Russia's last reigning empress, Catherine the Great, published the first Russian translation of the Bhagavad Gita. In the 19th century, Russian Tsar Paul I planned to invade British India to weaken the British Empire. The Tsar was assassinated. The plan was cancelled. Now, for most of modern history, relations between India and Russia remained tepid, even after the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922. And this was largely because Stalin did not think very highly of India, or should I say the leaders of India's independence movement.
This is actually very interesting. It's just interesting to see how India perceives Russia, and obviously all the countries have evolved over the century, etc. It's interesting to see because obviously what is close to my history is the communism and the world wars and all that. Yeah.
He thought of them as, quote unquote, running dogs of imperialism,
Interesting.
as tools of British and capitalist forces. He considered Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru as agents of counter-revolutionary forces. A staunch communist revolutionary, Stalin viewed their fight for independence as a conspiracy of the bourgeoisie aimed at keeping monopoly capitalism alive.
So this is very interesting. So considering that you guys have a strong ties with Russia, because that's obviously for us the communism and the way he perhaps has been speaking of India, similarly, perhaps these were the same views that he would have, you know, for the other countries, or like obviously Slovakia was back then a part of Soviet Union. So you can see, I guess, from whatever she's saying, how favorable people, you know, in my part of the world may view that.
So in 1947, when India became independent, Stalin reacted with open hostility,
Oh, wow.
something he maintained till his death in 1953. India-Russia relations remained cold until then. The ice broke in 1955 under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. He visited India that year and laid the foundation of an economic partnership.
Okay.
And for the next 6 years, Russia embarked on what they call de-Stalinization, a process which brought India closer to Russia. Moscow upheld Indian sovereignty in Kashmir.
I've never, obviously, I'm aware of the history in my part of the world, but I don't know how it relates to India and that there were, but you know, during the Khrushchev, it was communism here, and let me tell you, it wasn't nice.
Also over Goa, which used to be a Portuguese enclave. Around the same time, a rift emerged between China and Russia. The Chinese began viewing the Soviets with suspicion. They regarded Khrushchev's policies as a revisionist version of communism. Mao decided to disengage with Moscow. So it came as no surprise that in 1962, when India went to war with China, the Soviet Union maintained neutrality. And by doing so, it exceeded expectations it was never meant to meet. Moscow's refusal to back China was extremely significant. India began placing more trust in Russia. In 1970, when India conducted its first nuclear test, Washington was critical. It lectured India. In contrast, Moscow stressed. But,
I mean, Washington will always be lecturing other countries that are not, you know, that they might perceive as a threat, right? Or, and yeah, it's like, what if the West, let's say, is mocking India, and India then does something good and, you know, comes and proves itself. It's just like the kind of typical tactics, isn't it? Just so boring.
Stressed on the peaceful nature of the test. And India responded in kind. When the world slammed Moscow over its involvement in Hungary and the Czech Republic, India remained quiet. Even after the
Okay, I would have to check what was the involvement in Moscow and Czech Republic and Hungary, and why India would keep quiet, because we had 1968 in Slovakia, which means that tanks from Russia came to Slovakia to reinstitute communism, because apparently our communism wasn't strong enough. We had like something which was called like a socialism with a human face. And then we had to reestablish all the things, but they came with the tanks, and it was nice.
Soviet Union disintegrated, bilateral ties did not suffer. Yes, there were some ups and downs, but at the end of the day, the logic of geopolitics prevailed. Today, it manifests itself in every sphere.
But excuse me. But I guess from what she's looking at it, and she's calling out the geopolitics, and I guess obviously every country has their own different interests, and is maybe, you know, is taking a stance depending on the relationship. So perhaps that is what, you know, has been going on.
Take economy, for instance. Bilateral trade between India and Russia stands at $8.1 billion. Indian exports amount to $2.6 billion. Russian imports are at $5.48 billion. By 2025, they plan to take bilateral trade to $25 billion. In politics, both India and Russia collaborate. at platforms like the UN, G20, BRICS, and SCO.
Interesting.
In fact, it's often said that Russia brought India into the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in a bid to counter China. Then we come to defense. India is the second largest market for the Russian defense industry. Russia accounts for 68% of India's military.
So, of course, they will want to have a good relationships, especially defense supplies. So it's like if you're talking military, and if we're talking right now, Russia is in isolation. Obviously, it will try to improve relationships where it can, because right now with the West, it cannot.
Hardware import, followed by the United States and Israel. The Indo-Russian Intergovernmental Commission is one of the largest and most comprehensive governmental mechanisms that India has with any country. Almost every department from the government of India attends it. India's foreign secretary recently stated that without Russian spare parts, our ships won't sail and our planes won't fly.
So now there you have it. So I think it's a relationship, economical relationship between Russia and India seems, from what she's describing, very critical for the advancement of India. So it does appear like it's a mutually beneficial for both countries.
Together, India and Russia have launched several joint military programs.
There you have it.
Programs to develop state-of-the-art weapons like the BrahMos cruise missile, the Sukhoi fighter jet.
I had no idea. And now perhaps it can only develop something with India, considering West for now is really a no-go.
The Ilyushin transport aircraft and the Kamov twin-engine helicopters.
Wow.
India has also purchased and leased all kinds of military hardware from Russia, like the T-90S Bhishma battle tank, the Akula-2 nuclear submarine, the INS Vikramaditya. And how could we not mention the S-400 Triumph? The biggest bone of contention right now between India and the US. Why is that? You see, in 2018, India struck a $5.5 billion deal with Russia to buy the S-400 air defense system. The first unit is expected to be operational by the end of the year.
Okay.
What is the S-400? One of the most advanced and potent air defense systems in the world. It has the potential of repelling almost all sorts of aerial attacks. India needs the S-400 in order to protect itself from the growing threats from China and Pakistan. So why is the US upset?
Before we go into why is the US upset, I can see why. But this is very interesting. I never realized the strong ties between India and Russia, and it actually does start prior to the Ukrainian war. So let's see, why is America upset?
Well, multiple reasons. One, the US wants India to end its reliance on Russian weapons.
Of course it does. America wants the only allies of every country to be the US. So I don't know how you feel about that, but it makes total sense.
Importantly, in 2017, the US Congress passed a law called CAATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CAATSA. The aim of this law was to counter American adversaries like Iran, Russia, and North Korea, also to sanction the countries who deal with them. In 2020, the US imposed sanctions on Turkey, its long-standing NATO ally, because Turkey bought the S-400 from Russia.
Well,
in January this year, a US congressional report warned that if India buys the S-400, it will be sanctioned too. And despite the pressure, India went ahead with the deal. Reports say India will get a waiver on CAATSA, a one-time exception. Now, these are just reports. The fact is that the US cannot afford to sanction a strategic partner and a major market like India. The S-400 deal is expected to feature in the talks between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. Here's another subject they cannot miss.
Wow. I genuinely had no idea about the ties between India and Russia. And it does seem to have a big geopolitical consequences. So it's very interesting learning.
China. You see, Russia's perception of and relationship with China is changing. Moscow may not admit it, but there's a growing asymmetry in its ties with Beijing. At the same time, Russia's economic dependence on China is the highest ever. China is increasingly gaining an upper hand over Russia. It is overshadowing Russian investments in Central Asia. It is diluting Moscow's economic and military institutions, diminishing its importance as the most potent communist force.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Think that right now, China and India perhaps the only allies, if you like, of Russia.
Simply put, Russia's dominance is beginning to erode in the face of China's growing belligerence.
I mean, has there Russia's dominance right now? I mean, I know this is a year-old video, but the thing is, obviously, Russia is a large country, but has it ever, and this is my uneducated mind perhaps talking, been dominant? I mean, we don't see or hear, at least not in here. And maybe you can tell me different, your perceptions from the Indian point of view. I would only hear about people wanting to leave, not people wanting to stay. And, you know, the progress in the country is not great if you compare it with the Western world, minus all the bad things of the Western world. Yet still, when you look at the economical progress, etc., it takes part in the Western bloc, I believe, as opposed to Russia. Now, don't quote me on that because I don't have any facts, but that is just a perception economy, if you like, on my end from just the points of data I might have gathered. Also, as I mentioned, I'm very apolitical, but this is just like from talking to people, observing things, just my point of view.
And it is aware of this weakening position, but has decided to deal with it rather carefully, with ice cream diplomacy even. The circumstances compel Russia to do so. China remains its best bet in countering the US, so picking a fight with Beijing does not help. As for India, Russia suspects that India could move closer to the US orbit, into the US orbit, especially after the formation of the Quad.
So do you think that India could move closer to the US orbit, and you would prefer, considering there is an interest, so like liking towards Russia coming from India?
Which it perceives as a threat to its own interests. Simply put, Russia sees itself in a state of siege. China's growing ambitions and America's ever-expanding alliances are challenging Moscow. At a time like this, Russia wants to reassure itself if it can still regard India as a friend and not just as a defense customer. So when Vladimir Putin comes to New Delhi, his aim will be not just to sustain the traditional ties, but further deepen bilateral partnership, draw the nations together, and chalk out a path for a shared future.
Very interesting about the relationship. If there is anything else that you guys want to share with me about your relationship with Russia and why this is amicable. Now, I understand that, you know, obviously it evolved throughout the history, that during the dark side of communism, perhaps it wasn't there, like just like perhaps. It is just interesting because in the West, I think when we think of Russia, we don't think about history throughout, we think about communism. So it would be really great to know, like, what are the things that actually you like about Russia? And obviously they helped you throughout, but is there anything else? I mean, I find it quite transparent coming from Putin going to India and trying to strengthen the relationship where he sees that his position is weakening. Plus, there is no other ally almost for him in the world, especially not in the Western world. So I would be curious to hear your thoughts on this. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, take care. Bye.